At 54 years old, I had learned that the most valuable asset in a corporate office was not a brilliant mind, a silver tongue, or an aggressive drive, but a quiet and unshakable peace. For 4 long years, I had worked as a senior account executive at Apex Mutual Insurance, managing high-value client accounts that required absolute precision, deep industry knowledge, and a calm, reassuring demeanor. I loved my work precisely because it was structured and predictable. It allowed me to help ordinary people navigate the complex and often stressful aftermath of difficult life events. My workstation was my personal sanctuary, organized with meticulous care, and my professional reputation was built on steady, reliable results that spoke for themselves. I never felt the need to boast about the large accounts I secured during our weekly team meetings, nor did I forward the glowing thank you emails from grateful clients to the entire department directory. I simply arrived at my desk, completed my tasks with quiet diligence, signed off exactly at 5 o'clock in the evening, and went home to my family. This quiet, self-contained approach to my career seemed to work perfectly for everyone in the department, with the sole exception of Clara Jenkins. Clara had joined our office as an account executive 6 months after I did, and from her very first day, she made it clear that she was the complete opposite of quiet. She was ambitious in a way that felt sharp, nervous, and combative, constantly seeking to prove that she was the smartest person in any room she entered. She would interrupt my client phone calls to clarify minor points that I had already explained perfectly, send unsolicited emails to our department supervisor, Mr. Gerald Henderson, correcting non-existent formatting errors in my shared files, and volunteer to assist with my projects only to suggest confusing alterations that made no logical sense. What drove Clara absolutely mad was that she could not compete with something she could not see. Because I was quiet about my successes, she had no tangible target to aim for, which only seemed to fuel her growing obsession with my daily activities. She began monitoring my schedule with intense and unsettling scrutiny. Clara noted the exact minute I arrived in the morning, how long I spent on my lunch breaks in the cafeteria, and the frequency of my walks to the break room for water. She would frequently walk past my cubicle, looking over my shoulder to see what application was open on my screen, and then ask seemingly innocent questions about my workflow, only to suggest that my methods were outdated and inefficient. I recognized this behavior early on for what it was, a deliberate attempt to build a dossier of incompetence against me. Instead of reacting with anger or confronting her, I decided to play a quiet game of my own, leaving tiny, inconsequential breadcrumbs for her to find. I would occasionally send an internal department memo with a minor typo, only to send a polite correction an hour later. I would place a non-confidential project file in the wrong shared folder and move it to the correct path the very next morning. Clara devoured these tiny crumbs, documenting every single instance in a digital folder on her computer. I knew this because she had left her workstation open one afternoon while walking to the restroom, and I saw a document titled with my name, containing screenshots of my minor errors. While Clara was busy building her little prosecution file, I was focusing on a very different documentation project. For 18 months, I had been keeping a small leather-bound notebook in my desk drawer, dedicated to a personal gratitude journal. Every evening before leaving the office, I would write down 3 positive interactions from my workday. It was a private practice, inspired by a productivity podcast, meant to help me focus on the good things and maintain my mental well-being in a high-stress corporate environment. I wrote about the patience of Julian Fletcher from the accounting department, who helped me sort out complex billing issues, or the kindness of Eleanor Davis from Human Resources, who brought coffee for the team during long meetings. I recorded Mrs. Albright's warm words when I resolved a difficult insurance claim for her family. The entries were honest, detailed, and completely positive, capturing the quiet support that made our office function. Little did I know, this simple gratitude journal was about to become the center of a storm. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, while I was sitting in the break room unwrapping my sandwich, I noticed 2 compliance officers through the glass window, standing directly outside my cubicle. They wore navy blazers and carried clipboards, and one of them was already opening my desk drawers while wearing latex gloves. Clara Jenkins stood 3 cubicles away, holding a stack of papers and pretending to read, but her eyes were locked on my workspace. I watched them for a short moment before wrapping my sandwich back up and walking calmly toward my desk. I could feel the eyes of the entire department on me as I approached. My heart remained steady, though my mind was fully alert. I had anticipated that Clara would make a move, but I had not expected her to bring in corporate compliance. This was an escalation, a public trial, and I knew that whatever happened next would define my future at the company. I took a deep breath, adjusted my collar, and stepped into my cubicle, ready to face whatever allegations Clara had manufactured to destroy my career. I stepped into my workspace and stopped just behind the 2 officers who were examining my belongings. "Find anything interesting?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and polite. The taller compliance officer looked up from my bottom filing cabinet, while the shorter one, holding a clipboard, adjusted his glasses. "Edward Vance?" the taller officer asked, checking a form on his clipboard. "We are conducting a formal compliance inspection of your workstation. We received detailed reports of multiple professional violations, including systematic errors in client communications, potential security breaches involving client records, and general workspace disorganization that poses an operational risk." The shorter officer added that they were required to perform a thorough audit of my workspace, computer files, and physical documents before I could be allowed to resume my duties. I glanced past them and caught sight of Clara Jenkins. She was standing near the copier, pretending to scan documents, but her head was tilted in our direction, a faint smirk playing on her lips. She was convinced that this was the end for me, that her months of documentation would finally bear fruit. I turned back to the officers and gestured to my desk. "Please, go ahead," I said. "I have nothing to hide." I stood by quietly as they began their work. They photographed my computer monitor, which showed a clean, organized inbox and a properly secured database. They examined my physical files, which were color-coded, alphabetical, and perfectly stored in their respective cabinets. The shorter officer went through my desk drawers, checking for any unsecured client information or personal items that violated company policy. In the top drawer, his hand brushed against my leather-bound notebook. "What is this?" he asked, pulling it out and flipping it open. "Is this a log of client files?" I shook my head and replied that it was just my personal gratitude journal where I recorded positive daily interactions. The officer glanced at the first page, reading the handwriting. His expression, which had been stern and professional, softened slightly. He read a few lines, then looked up at his colleague. They exchanged a brief, silent look. The taller officer stepped closer and took the notebook, reading the page. In my journal, I had written about the time Julian Fletcher from accounting spent 45 minutes after hours helping me resolve a client billing discrepancy, and how his patience had turned a stressful afternoon into a positive experience. On another page, I had documented how Eleanor Davis from Human Resources had stayed late to help a new hire adjust to the department, showing incredible kindness. The officers did not put the book down. Instead, they sat at my desk, flipping through the pages from the beginning. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The entire office had gone quiet, the clicking of keyboards had slowed, and my coworkers were watching the scene unfold. Clara Jenkins had stepped closer, her smirk fading as she realized the compliance officers were not confiscating my computer or escorting me from the building. They were reading my personal notebook with intense focus, whispering to each other and nodding. The shorter officer looked up at me, his eyes filled with curiosity. "Mr. Vance, how long have you been keeping this journal?" he asked. I replied that I had been writing in it for 18 months. The taller officer asked if the entries were authentic and if I had written them without any official purpose. I explained that it was just a personal practice to help me focus on the positive aspects of my job and maintain my sanity in a demanding environment. The officers exchanged another look, and then the taller one stood up. He closed the journal, but held onto it. He looked across the room and spotted Clara Jenkins, who was trying to look busy. "Miss Jenkins," the officer called out, "could you please step into the conference room with us?" Clara looked startled. Her eyes darted from the officers to me, then back to the officers. The confidence seemed to drain from her face as she nodded slowly. The three of them walked into the small glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall, leaving me standing in my cubicle. I took a seat at my desk, my heart beating with a quiet sense of anticipation. I could see them talking through the glass, but I could not hear their words. Clara was gesturing wildly, pointing toward my cubicle, but the compliance officers remained calm, holding my journal and showing her pages of it. Clara's face began to turn red, and then, to my surprise, her eyes welled up with tears. The power dynamic in that room had shifted entirely, and Clara was no longer the accuser. She sat there in the chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen her, as the officers methodically walked through the evidence of her own hostile actions. I watched as they pointed to the journal entries and then to the printed screenshots she had provided them. The officers were comparing my record of daily workplace appreciation with her cold, analytical documentation of my minor errors. Even from a distance, the contrast was painfully obvious, and Clara could do nothing but look down as her plan crumbled before her eyes. The shorter officer pointed to an entry where I praised Eleanor Davis, noting that it matched Eleanor official files of support, and then they pointed to Julian Fletcher entry. The officers looked disappointed in Clara, and their expressions conveyed that her campaign was complete nonsense. The meeting in the glass conference room lasted for nearly 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Through the partition, I watched Clara Jenkins shrink in her chair as the compliance officers pointed to the leather notebook. They were showing her specific entries, pointing to names and asking questions. I sat at my desk, quietly answering emails, but keeping my eyes on the conference room. I remembered the day I started writing that journal. I had just lost a client due to circumstances beyond my control, and I felt completely defeated. Writing down 3 positive interactions that evening was the only thing that kept me from quitting. Over the 18 months, the notebook had become a shield against the stress of the corporate world. Now it was acting as a shield in a very different way. I was glad that I had kept the journal, not knowing that it would eventually serve as the ultimate defense against an unexpected threat to my livelihood. I watched Clara's gestures, which grew increasingly defensive as the officers compared my genuine appreciation with her tracking folder. When the doors finally opened, Clara walked out quickly, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She did not look at me or anyone else. She gathered her purse and ran toward the elevators, leaving her workstation completely untouched. The 2 compliance officers walked back to my cubicle. The taller officer placed my gratitude journal back on the desk. Mr. Vance, the shorter officer, said, "We have completed our inspection. We found absolutely no evidence of professional misconduct, client record breaches, or safety violations. In fact, your workspace and digital files are some of the most organized we have seen in this department." I smiled and thanked them, but the taller officer was not finished speaking. However, he said, "This investigation brought some very serious issues to light. During our review of your gratitude journal, we noticed something interesting. In 18 months, you have written about 63 different people in this building. You have praised your colleagues, accounting staff, human resources, the cleaning crew, and even security personnel for their helpfulness and professionalism." I nodded, confirming that I wrote about anyone who made the day better. The officer continued, noting that in all those entries, representing hundreds of positive workplace interactions, Clara Jenkins' name appeared 0 times. The words hung in the air between us. The officer looked at me with a steady gaze and explained that while they were reviewing Clara's folder of accusations, they realized she had spent months tracking my movements, taking unauthorized screenshots of my computer screen, and compiling private notes on my daily schedule. "The irony is," the officer said, "she was so focused on trying to prove you were incompetent that she failed to realize how her own behavior looked from the outside. Your journal created an accidental, unbiased record of workplace relationships. It showed that while you were building others up, Clara was entirely focused on tearing you down." The compliance officers packed up their clipboards and prepared to leave. As they walked toward the exit, I overheard one of them comment to the other about how someone could work in an office for 18 months and never once perform a single helpful act for a colleague. I sat at my desk, looking at my journal. The compliance storm had passed, leaving me completely cleared, but it had left a deep mark on the office. My coworkers, who had watched Clara flee in tears, were whispering. By the end of the day, everyone knew that Clara's compliance investigation had backfired. She did not return for the rest of the afternoon, and her empty chair stood as a silent testament to the failure of her campaign. The next morning, Clara Jenkins arrived at the office exactly at 9 o'clock. The change in her behavior was immediate and dramatic. She did not sigh loudly over her workload or make grand announcements about her busy schedule. She did not hover around my cubicle or offer unsolicited advice to the junior staff. She sat at her desk, kept her head down, and worked in complete silence. For a brief moment, I thought this might be a positive turning point. Perhaps she had realized the destructive nature of her toxicity and decided to focus on doing her job. I hoped we could move forward in peace, but I was wrong. Clara was not defeated. She was simply changing her tactics, preparing to launch a new, more subtle assault on my reputation. I watched her from my desk, noting how she avoided eye contact with everyone. The silence from her corner of the room was almost heavy, a sharp contrast to her usual bustling presence. The rest of the team seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, but I remained cautious. I knew that someone who had invested so much energy into documenting my alleged failures would not give up so easily. She was wounded, her pride damaged, and that made her more dangerous than before. She was waiting, searching for a new angle to attack, and it did not take long for her to find one. I noticed her looking at my desk drawer where I kept the journal, her eyes narrowing as she formulated her next move in this silent corporate battle. 3 days after the compliance officers cleared my name, Julian Fletcher from accounting walked over to my desk during our afternoon break. He leaned against the partition, keeping his voice very low. "Edward," he said, "I think you should know what Clara is doing." I saved my current file and looked up at him. "What do you mean?" Julian explained that Clara had cornered him in the break room the previous afternoon. She was asking if he knew that I was keeping a secret notebook, documenting personal details about my colleagues without their knowledge or consent. She was trying to convince people that my gratitude journal was actually a form of surveillance, a creepy privacy violation. According to Julian, Clara had also approached Eleanor Davis in Human Resources and was planning to talk to Mr. Henderson. She was telling everyone that recording people interactions without their permission was a major violation of workplace privacy. Julian added that Clara was actively telling people from the marketing and claims departments that my notebook was a liability for the company and that the legal team, or HR, should intervene to confiscate it. She was trying to see if I had written anything negative about Mr. Henderson to turn him against me. I felt a cold chill run through me. Clara was trying to turn my positive habit into a sinister surveillance campaign. She could not accept that her compliance attack had failed, so she was trying to poison my relationships. During my commute home that evening, I thought about how easy it is to twist something positive into something dark. I felt vulnerable, knowing that my private words of appreciation were being discussed in hushed tones in the break room. I stared at a blank email draft for 20 minutes, typing and deleting sentences, trying to find the right approach. I realized that if I hid the notebook or stopped writing, it would look like an admission of guilt. By the end of the week, I started to notice the effects of her whispering campaign. Eleanor Davis, who usually stopped by my desk to chat about her weekends, simply gave me a polite nod and walked past. Mr. Henderson's responses to my emails became brief and formal. Even the security guard at the front desk, Peter, who always smiled when I arrived, seemed guarded. Clara was successfully planting seeds of doubt, turning my coworkers against me. I knew I had to act, but confronting her directly would only make me look defensive and guilty. It would play right into her hand, making it seem like I was obsessed with office politics. Instead, I decided to address the issue with complete transparency. On Monday morning, I drafted an email and sent it to the entire department, including Clara and Mr. Henderson. The subject line read, "Personal Journal Transparency and Consent." In the email, I explained that some people might have heard about my personal gratitude journal. I clarified that the journal was a private tool to help me maintain a positive outlook by recording moments of kindness and teamwork. I emphasized that it was never shared with management or used for any professional evaluation. However, I wrote, I want to ensure that everyone feels comfortable. If anyone prefers that I do not write about our positive interactions in my personal journal, please let me know, and I will immediately respect your preference. Within an hour, my inbox began to fill with replies. The responses were not what Clara had anticipated. Eleanor Davis was the first to write back, stating that she found the practice beautiful and asked me to continue writing about our interactions. Julian Fletcher replied, telling me to keep writing and wishing more people focused on gratitude instead of complaints. Mr. Henderson sent a longer email, praising my professionalism and transparency, noting that a gratitude practice was an excellent way to maintain a positive attitude. Diana from Claims wrote that the message was a breath of fresh air and asked to be included in my notebook because it was nice to know that our work is noticed. George from IT added that my transparency was refreshing, noting that in a department where people usually hide their notes and files, it was nice to see someone sharing their intentions so openly. Out of the 37 people in our department, 36 sent warm, supportive messages expressing their appreciation. The only person who did not reply was Clara Jenkins. Her silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the wave of positivity that swept through the office. Her plan to turn my coworkers against me had failed completely, and instead it had highlighted just how isolated she was in her negativity. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the office began to change. People were talking about the email, and many of them expressed how reassuring it was to see such transparency. Clara attempts to frame my journal as a creepy surveillance tool had completely collapsed, leaving her even more alienated than before. She had tried to weaponize privacy concerns, but my open invitation for consent had disarmed her completely. The seeds of doubt she had tried to plant had failed to take root, and the department was now more united than ever. Coworkers began stopping by my desk just to say they appreciated the email, further cementing the bond of trust between us. In the weeks that followed my email, the atmosphere in our office began to shift. The concept of gratitude, which had started as my private practice, became a shared culture. Eleanor Davis started leaving small thank you notes on colleagues' desks. Julian Fletcher brought pastries for the accounting team with a note expressing appreciation for their hard work. Even Mr. Henderson began our weekly meetings by publicly recognizing team members who had gone above and beyond. Mr. Henderson also set up a gratitude board in the main break room, where employees could pin notes of appreciation for their colleagues. The workplace became warmer, more collaborative, and far more productive. But as the office culture grew more positive, Clara Jenkins' isolation became impossible to ignore. In an environment where people actively looked for reasons to support one another, her constant criticism and hostile behavior stood out. She tried to adapt, but her attempts at gratitude were forced and insincere. She pinned a note on the gratitude board, but it read like a backhanded insult, thanking the claims department for finally completing their files on time. People rolled their eyes, and it only highlighted her inability to show genuine appreciation. It was a painful but necessary lesson in the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and respect. She even tried to start her own notebook, but her entries were filled with complaints about others and boasts about her own performance. 3 weeks after I sent the transparency email, Mr. Henderson called me into his office. He asked me to close the door and sit down. "Edward," he said, "I want to thank you for your email and for introducing this positive culture to our team. The change in morale has been incredible." I told him I was glad it helped, but Mr. Henderson's face remained serious. He opened a folder on his desk and explained that the new focus on workplace relationships had highlighted a very concerning pattern. He had been reviewing historical complaints and observing interactions more closely. He pointed to a list of incidents, all involving Clara Jenkins. She had a history of undermining colleagues, creating conflict, and disrupting team projects. He explained that the compliance officers had also submitted their final report regarding Clara actions. During her attempt to accuse me, Clara had taken unauthorized screenshots of my computer screen, which contained sensitive client databases and financial records. This action was a direct violation of California Penal Code, Section 502, which strictly prohibits unauthorized data access and copying of computer records. Mr. Henderson looked at me and said that using company resources to wage a personal campaign against a colleague was unacceptable, but accessing and copying secure client data crossed a legal boundary. He revealed that the compliance department and IT security had conducted a full forensic audit of her computer and found she had downloaded restricted client profiles to a USB drive in order to search for minor errors. Because of her violations of California Penal Code, Section 502, and her history of creating a hostile work environment, the legal department had decided to remove her immediately. She was being transferred to a small branch office in another state, where she would work under strict supervision with no collaborative responsibilities. Clara had tried to argue that it was a double standard because I kept a journal, but the legal team pointed out that my journal did not contain any client data, social security numbers, or sensitive financial. It only contained simple descriptions of colleagues' helpful behavior, which was entirely public and non-confidential. I felt a wave of relief, but also a quiet sadness for Clara. The very investigation she had launched to destroy my career had instead exposed her own actions and forced her departure. Mr. Henderson smiled and handed my journal back to me, noting that the notebook she tried to use as a weapon had instead proven how much respect I had earned. 2 months later, Clara requested a permanent transfer and moved away. My gratitude journal remains in my desk drawer, and I still write in it every evening. Sometimes the best victory is not about fighting back with anger, but about living with such authenticity that negativity simply cannot survive around you. Looking back, I realized that the compliance audit was not the end of my career, but the beginning of a better workplace for everyone. Clara had tried to use the rules of the company to tear me down, but the truth of our daily interactions was far more powerful than any fabricated list of violations. By focusing on appreciation and maintaining my integrity, I had allowed the system to work as it should. The final result was not just my vindication, but a complete transformation of our department's culture. I turned the page of my notebook, ready to write down the positive moments of another peaceful day, knowing that some of the greatest victories in life are won in absolute silence, one simple entry at a time. The simple notebook remained a testament to the power of focus, proving that what we choose to document is ultimately what we invite into our professional lives. It was a reminder that true success is not measured by who we defeat, but by who we support along the way.